In our next panel, after we have already heard about the experiences of transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, after we have heard about values, democracy was already touched, challenges to democracy, in our next panel we will discuss one of the most debated topics of our times, which is the relationship between democracy and leadership. So the question is strong leadership a threat to democracy? And as we are the Körber History Forum, we take a certain perspective on this. We are discussing this question from the angle of history, so in terms of asking ourselves, what does history teach us when it comes to the fragile balance between personality, power, and populism? In the following 90 minutes, we are going to discuss on the panel and with you in the audience with our 4 distinguished guests. And I start with the ladies, with the female speakers. We are very happy that Sylvie Kauffmann, editorial director of Le Monde in Paris, joined us for this panel. If you have read the program, you might have seen that originally we were planning to have Ruth Ben-Jihad, historian from New York, here with us. She fell ill, she couldn't travel from the US, and so we are very grateful that Sylvie, you agreed to join this panel. Then with us is Zoltán Balog, former Minister for Human Resources under Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban between 2012 and 2018, and since 2007 until now, President of the Foundation for a Civic Hungary, among many other functions, but these are the most important ones. And then Professor Archie Brown, Professor Emeritus of Politics at Oxford University and at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. And last but not least, just arrived from Vienna, Timothy Snyder, Professor of History at Yale University and Permanent Fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, one of the most quoted historians of our times, and the person to discuss issues of leadership and democracy and the way towards freedom or unfreedom. And last but not least, our moderator, Brössler of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. So, without much further ado, may I kindly ask you on stage and start the discussion on leadership and democracy, and is leadership a threat to democracy? Please.
I'm here. Sie müssen hier sein. Okay. Ich bin hier. Alles klar. So, spielt keine Rolle. Nee, ich glaube. So, sind wir zu hören? Sind wir zu hören?
Can everybody hear us? All right, good morning. It's a pleasure, after this very interesting introduction this morning, to be able to have this discussion right now. We have a very interesting panel, and let me start with a quotation that I'm going to read. We always rejected to fight in such a way that the good ones would be on one side, the bad ones on the other, the patriots on one hand and the traitors on the other side. The national idea, the populist policy, is in stark contrast to liberalism. The liberals want freedom for the people so that it can engage in enterprise and vote freely. The populists would like to put the people above everything else. That is a quotation from 1992, and Mr. Balog may know who said this. It was said by Viktor Orban. Over the next 90 minutes, we now would like to discuss what has happened ever since those early years, what happened in Europe with Orban, what happened in the world. We are going to talk about the strong leaders. In English, it's easier to talk about leaders. We Germans have to choose our words carefully because Führer has a very negative connotation, so we call it Anführer. There are many people who say leadership and strong leadership is a danger to democracy, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, in Hungary. We also would like to talk about democracy that hasn't got a chance in Russia, for instance. And we are also going to speak about those areas where democracies seem to be so solid and robust, like in Western Europe and in the United States of America, where we also see certain concerns. Mr. Balog, what would you say about the way that Viktor Orban governs Hungary for many years? You were part of the governments. Good morning, and thanks for giving me this invitation to come here. I think such gatherings where we do not only talk about one another but with one another, which is a slogan of the Körber Foundation. I think this is very important. Viktor Orban is doing fine and Hungary is doing fine as well, and so I think there is definitely a misunderstanding where you think a strong leadership immediately is a danger to democracy. I think that strong leadership can be a danger, but also an opportunity. And so it all depends on the balance between a strong personality and democratic legitimacy. So the quotation you gave, don't think it is forgotten. No. We think that today's Hungarian government is legitimized. In 2010 we had the last election, and we had a period between 1998 and 2002 where we were in the government and people knew what to do in 2010, and twice they have expressed their trust and confidence and placed their trust and confidence in the governing party. So I do think that leadership style might be different in Hungary compared to other countries, but of course every country has specificities. But you would confirm that it is a strong leadership. What created the prerequisites in Hungary for this very specific way in which Orban has been governing the country for a couple of years? He has a strong majority, two-third majority in parliament. What created the prerequisites for him to come to power and create such leadership? In 2010, our country was both economically, financially, and morally in a bad shape. We were on an economic development level comparable to Greece, and we needed a strong leadership in order to overcome this economic downturn. And I think the economic and social policy situation was such that people thought that the government could overcome these deficits. At any rate, we wanted to promote economic development, and we also wanted to have a very sound family policy in order to serve our national interests. And I think that it was the prerequisite. On the one hand side, the crisis. On the other hand, Hungarians needed a genuine answer to the question of how could they improve their quality of life. Before I open the panel, let me ask one more question about something that was important, especially in the run-up to the European elections. Do you need an enemy image to keep up such a strong form of leadership? Do we need an enemy? Do we need an opponent that is visible to everyone, such as maybe George Soros or the EU Commission? so that the membership of Fidesz in the European People's Parties has been suspended. Do you need those strong enemy stereotypes in order to keep up a strong leadership and mobilize the people on a constant basis? I mean, they're things that have been mixed that do not belong to each other. I mean, you talk. Well, we do have a tradition in Hungary, and President Komorowski has talked about the last 30 years, about the specificities or non-specificities of the mentality of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, Hungary had the same history over many years. Only 10% of the time we were truly independent, and there were 20 years approximately of independence after the First World War. And I think this mentality of resistance is present in the minds of our people. And of course you need a kind of knowledge about who is the person or the entity we have to defend against. So this kind of situation where we are understood or misunderstood, I mean, that has something to do with our mentality. This mentality might give the impression that we have this defense-based mindset, and if somebody can say, yes, I'm here for you, I'm going to defend you, that is something that is appealing to the people, this kind of leadership style. Probably for Hungarians it's more appealing than to people in our neighborhood. Well, what would you say? Do you think that Central Europe at the moment is a fertile ground for the strong guys, the strong men, the populists? We have many examples, Kaczynski in Poland, Babiš in Czechia. Do you think that's a special situation, a fertile, a breeding ground in Central and Eastern Europe that we seek?
Different situation, we tend to say Visegrad, you know, to see if from Western Europe, we tend to see Visegrad group as a group, but it's very different from one country to another, and the leaders are indeed very different. I think Mr. Kaczynski and Mr. Orban are very, very different animals, and the way we deal with them in the West is also very different. I mean, Mr. Kaczynski, for instance, doesn't meet foreign leaders. He doesn't speak foreign languages.
You met Mrs. Merkel one day.
Well, yeah, that's the exception, but you know, he doesn't travel. So Viktor Orban is a very different person. I think, for instance, Emmanuel Macron can have a very lively and open discussion with Viktor Orban, which would be much more difficult with Kaczynski, of course. And so, and then, you know, in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, it's also a different type of leaders. So I think each country has its specific conditions, and what matters also is not so much, I mean, of course leaders do matter, but the political system around them, and mostly the checks and balances, whether they work or not. I mean, having a strong leader checked by democratic mechanisms which work and which may counterbalance this strong leadership if it goes too far. From a French point of view, we'll talk about this later, but this is something we know about. So, you know, I think the problem in Central Europe is because these democracies are not as old as, you know, or the democratic mechanism and systems are not so deeply ingrained as in other democracies, it is more difficult to keep those leaders in check.
But how important is the historical context? How important is this feeling of maybe not being treated equally? Does that help strong leaders?
Yes, I mean, there is indeed a feeling in Central Europe of double standards, of the fact that we haven't, you know, that we have integrated these former communist countries within the European Union. but that they are not being treated as equal, and they are kind of second-class countries. There is, I mean, you cannot deny that there is this resentment, that it exists, and it, of course, I mean, then we can discuss whether it's totally true or not, and whether it's funded, and when, you know, the arguments for and against, but it is true that it feeds into the discourse of those leaders, and it helps them to build their power. Yeah.
Timothy Snyder, wir haben es sehr kurz.
Timothy Snyder, we just briefly touched upon this. From your point of view, what role does the nationalist play, the national narrative play, for a strong leader like Orban? So also racist tones and sounds. I mean, you hear nationalist rhetoric in our German ears. A lot of what Orban is saying in Hungary sounds nationalist, like folkish. So maybe you're translating it wrong. So maybe that's something what you hear often in the translation from Hungary. So folkish nationalist is not what we use. It's a translation in the German context. Sure, I said in our context. I said in our German ears it sounds folkish or nationalist. I don't know what it sounds like for Timothy Snyder, but I'd like to follow up that with a question of this. Where would Orban be today in his power position without the migration crisis of 2015?
In a different way. My understanding of this panel is that we're meant to be thinking comparatively about the 1920s and 1930s. And I'd like to do that seriously rather than just talk about things that have happened in the last couple of years. So if we're going to seriously think about the 1920s and 1930s and compare it to now and use the word leadership, I think we have to ask what leaders then were leading people to. So my basic problem with this panel is that I don't think these people are strong, nor do I think they're leaders, right? And so I can't answer a question which takes as its premise that we have this problem of strong leaders and now let's explain it, because I don't think that's the problem. Let's start with the word leader. In the 1920s and 1930s, people like Hitler and Mussolini actually knew where they were leading their people to. Hitler was leading his people to a colonial war for Ukrainian food and oil in the Caucasus. Mussolini knew he was leading his people to an imperial war for Ethiopia. This is crucial. It's a crucial difference between 100 years ago and now. That world was still an imperial world. There was still space. And so the idea, so what is a leader? I mean, let's try not to think metaphorically. A leader is someone you follow from one place to another place. Now let's think about politics now. How many serious imperialists are there out there? How much space is actually changing hands? I mean, sure, Crimea, fine, a few villages in Kosovo, but the world is no longer a place where leaders carry out serious colonial wars in an attempt to change the territorial dispensation in a major way. Now, this is a very serious difference because there is a kind of rule of political relativity which has to do with the relationship between space and time. If you can't lead your people in space, that is, if the age of imperialism is over, you have to lead them in time. And that's a very different prospect. So all of these people who we're talking about as strong leaders, right? Where are they leading their people? They're leading them in time and they're leading them backwards. That's the thing that every single one of these people who we have in mind have in common. Right? Whether it's Orban or, so we ask what they have in common. Orban, Kaczynski, Putin, Trump, you name it, Bolsonaro. The one thing they do have in common is the return not to the historical past, because the historical past is complicated, but to the mythical national past. They can't travel in space. They're not leaders in that sense, right? They can only travel in time. So Mr. Orban, for example, can talk about Trianon, but as opposed to Hungarian leaders in the 1920s and 1930s, there is no serious intention to actually take territory back from Romania or from Slovakia. That is a major difference, whether we're talking about Orban or whether we're talking about anyone else. I mean, you ask about the national question. This makes the whole national question different. The national question used to be, how far can I project my national claims across the world? That's very different from how deeply can I express my national resentment. Those are two very different kinds of leadership, which leads me to the word strong. What do we mean by the word strong here? It seems to me that the difference between political styles that you began your question to the Hungarian colleague with is also a question about what's strong and what's weak. A liberal point of view says there can be more power in the world for everyone. The Schmittian us and them politics says the idea is to create less power for everyone, and we will therefore lose less than the other people. So is Mr. Putin a strong leader when the economy of Russia is smaller than the economy of Italy and will presumably always be so? No, he's not strong in the sense of making his country stronger. He's strong in the sense of making the United States of America and the European Union weaker, right? Now that's a different definition of strong, right? And the same holds again for all of these people. Has Mr. Trump made the United States of America objectively more capable of projecting any kind of power, military through ideological, around the world? No, he's made us weaker in every single dimension. He's only strong insofar as he's made other people weaker than he is, right? So this whole question of strong leadership, I think, has to incorporate a definition of what we mean by leader and what we mean by strong. Because when we ask what the difference between now and then was, it brings us back to what the capabilities of the leaders are. And the capabilities of the leaders, interestingly, very often have to do with making their countries less powerful than they might be otherwise.
But how... Could I? Yeah, please.
I'd like to come in here because I've written a whole book on what we mean by a leader and what we mean by strong. And I think nobody has really distinguished yet between strong leadership collectively and a strong individual leader. By a strong leader, I mean one who concentrates as much power as possible in his or her hands, tries to take all the big decisions, dominates his or her party and government, and is basically a power maximizer. And I argue that that is usually harmful. You'll find the occasional leader who fits into that category, who does more good than harm, but usually it's harmful. In an authoritarian system, a collective leadership is usually a lesser evil than personal dictatorship. The Brezhnev leadership in the Soviet Union was much less murderous than Stalin's dictatorship. And within countries moving from authoritarianism to democracy, a more collegial leadership has been more conducive to successful transition. So I'm not against strong government in the sense of strong leadership collectively, in the sense of a government that can get things done. That's good. But the leader who concentrates power as much as possible in his or her hands and cultivates a cult of the personality of the leader, that is wrong. I was reading in the Financial Times on Saturday an Indian member of parliament saying that if you're against Modi, you're against India. Our leader has come and we must follow him. A member of the legislature in Russia said, with Putin there is Russia, without Putin there is no Russia. Well, this is absurd, this kind of cult of personality. So concentrating power in the hands of an individual, encouraging a cult of the personality of the leader, that's what I mean by the myth of the strong leader.
So, I mean, in contrast to Timothy Snyder, you would say to use just for the use of our debate here, the use of the term strong leader is not misleading. That's the use you would use for Mr. Orban, for others in the region, or would you say there's actually a point in asking, is strong leader actually the word we should use?
Yes,
Since there seems to be no real argument here in the question that even though they might be strong leaders, they're not leading their country to a strong position. I mean, those are...
Can I come in on that? I mean, Archie Brown has written wonderful biographies which are very clear on this question. I want to make a point about a historical point within Archie Brown's framework. So if we accept a strong leader meaning this, it would mean that the strong leader is good at clearing out the rivals. So if we look at strong leaders in the middle of the 20th century, whether they are fascist, whether they are Stalinist, or whether they are capitalist, all of them in different ways had a view about economic inequality and what to do with oligarchs. We remember this, right? That like the fascists actually had a view about wealth, and the Stalinists had a view about wealth, and the Keynesians and the Roosevelts of the world also had a view about wealth. So if we're going to characterize the Putins and the Trumps and the Orbans and so on as strong leaders, my question would be, what are they doing about wealth inequality? And what is their position vis-a-vis their local and the international oligarchy? Because my view would be that their position is much weaker than the position of classical mid-century, 20th century leaders. I think or to put it in a slightly more provocative way, the Marxist critique of the 20s and 30s, the idea was that the far right is hiding the oligarchs, was probably not true. But I think in the first part of the 21st century, it comes much closer to being true. It's very hard to say that a Trump or an Orban is handling the oligarchs in his own country. On the contrary.
How should we call Mr. Orban, if not strong leader?
A friend of China, I think, would be I mean, no, because that's another thing about strong, right? I mean, the European Union could be a major power center. You know, I realize we're in Germany and so on. Must be the Poles are of course immediately nodding, right? The ones who used to be in power. I mean, the European Union could be a major center of power, right? Compared to the state of Hungary or the state of Poland, right, or even the state of Germany, it could be a power of that is orders of magnitude greater. In the case of Hungary and Poland, 2 orders of magnitude. In the case of Germany, an order of magnitude. It could be, right? So if one is concerned about strength really, one would be trying to maximize the power of the European Union. So all of the friends, so the populists in the European Union tend to have the common feature that they like Russia and China, which for me is not a sign of strength. For me, that's a sign of weakness.
Entschuldige mich, aber ich würde kurz noch mal beim Beispiel konkret.
So I'd like to stay with the example of Hungary in concrete terms, and maybe because it's also maybe it's a smaller example, a smaller scale example, what we're talking about. Timothy Snyder described what he thinks. Professor Brown. So what do you say? How much democracy is still in Hungary? How much authoritarian rule is still to be found in the Hungarian system, or is it a system? I read this once, sui generis.
If you directed the question to me, I'm not a specialist on Hungary. I think someone else should answer that. But my primary concern is that Orban does seem to encourage something of a cult of his personality, that he does seem to hoard power in his hands, and in general, this is harmful. I believe that in a democracy, members of a government should not have the slightest hesitation in contradicting the leader. When you get a British cabinet in which people were afraid to contradict Margaret Thatcher, and ministers would discuss, how will this play with the Prime Minister, rather than say what they really thought to her. Eventually, of course, this was her undoing. They collectively overthrew her. But for a long time, she got her way because she believed she was right on everything. Similarly, with Tony Blair and the war in Iraq, only Robin Cook in the British cabinet, had the sense and courage to resign from the cabinet in good time and protest against it. Others went along with it. So I think in any country, whether it's Britain or Hungary, when a leader gets into the kind of position where people are afraid to contradict him, this will lead to bad governance, bad decisions. And so collegiality, we talk about strength. A lot of people use strong leader as a kind of synonym for good leader. Then it becomes meaningless. We can all be in favor of strong leaders if they mean good leaders. But there are so many characteristics of leaders which are more important than strength in the sense of power maximization. Integrity, intelligence, articulateness, ability to absorb information, ability to seek other points of view, empathy, many things indeed. This is what we should look for in a leader. But people speak about strong leaders all the time. What we want is a strong leader. And it's very dangerous whether it's Hungary or anywhere else.
Sylvie Kauffmann, womit haben wir es zu tun?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this comparison between Orban and Putin. I mean, we have two different systems, and as President Komorowski earlier said, Hungary is within the European Union, and though many of us think that the EU is not managing this process well and that Article 7 is going there and there, and so, I mean, it does put a lot of pressure, and things would probably be different if, you know, if there was not all this mechanism from the European Union. Yeah, well, we may discuss it. But Putin is, I agree with you, he's not strong because he's not taking his country towards, you know, in a position of he's not making his country strong, but he's having a strong foreign policy. And the other thing is that he controls all the leverage of power, all the tools of power. And he's even stronger than Soviet leaders, because Soviet leaders had the Politburo, and they could be sacked by the Politburo, you know, institutionally. Putin cannot, and he decides alone. We don't know how he decides, and there's no, I mean, there's no, you wouldn't say that there was transparency in the communist, with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but you could learn a few things through the statements of the meetings of the Central Committee, whatever. There were, you know, we don't know about the process of decision now about Putin, or we know very, very little. So, so there is a command of leadership there, which is which makes him very, very strong, I think.
Wir kommen gleich auf Putin zu sprechen.
We will come to talk about Putin in a minute, but what Timothy Snyder said was interesting, and he said that somebody like Mr. Orban is not a strong leader, but something like rather like a parody of a strong leader. So how can this nimbus of a strong leader actually emerge, and how important is the media landscape for this in a country like Hungary? Would that be possible at all in a media landscape that is more diverse and freer?
This is a question for Mr. Balog.
It will. He is waiting, and he will.
That controlling the media, controlling the media is definitely a big part of this strategy.
Ja, es gibt hier.
So there's stereotypes here with which that don't mean much, because everything is put into one box. So if someone at some point is not in conformity, not so non-conformity, so all the other attributes are put into this populist and nationalist, and maybe also dictators, etc. All of that is put into one box, and then the image is there, which is negative, is the great danger for democracy or for the liberal democracy. So with this kind of approach doesn't mean anything to me. So you should take it individually and step by step, and that's why I can only pick up one point that you just picked up on, and that is the weakness. So is Hungary weaker than 2010, that when we started to with our government work? Well, is it as strong as it could be? Well, that's a good question, but at least we've got economic growth of more than 4%, and the second best in Europe last year. Unemployment is close to 3%. The budget deficit under 2%. And when we took over government in 2010, that was more than 10%. So those are facts, those are numbers, and that just shows that Hungary today is much stronger than in the time before Orban, or before Orban's government. And so that is much about the general situation, but now concrete about the person. So it doesn't mean anything to me that when you say a prime minister cannot be criticized. I mean, I was in the cabinet for 6 years, and sometimes we just had a heated debate until 1:30 at night, and there was disputes and pros and cons, and there's also an official public discussion. You can describe Mr. Orban as a devil, and you've got a big posse, not just like Soros and Juncker, but also with Orban. That's a different way of conducting politics, that somebody cannot do it because there's some regulation that would prevent that, that's not true. So what Timothy Snyder said, also in the historical context, where is Viktor Orban leading his country to? So his, from your point of view, strong leadership, where is it leading to? What's the goal? Well, and I see also such posters in established and conformist parties. So we want to have the European Union, we want to change the European Union, and we want to become strong in the European Union. But we believe that the decision-making in this framework doesn't correspond with what serves our interests. And we've heard already, and I also believe, and I would contradict with all respect, the Polish president. So there's still the double standards, and that gives us a reason to defend. So in many cases, this is the case that the so-called new member countries are not integrated into the discussions, into the decision-making so much as so if I try to distill the answers, where does he want to go? He's got a claim going beyond Hungary, and he wants to change the European Union in the direction of the illiberal democracy of which he talks about. Did I say that?
Nein, das habe ich nicht gesagt. Das ist
No, I didn't say that. That's the wrong interpretation of what I said. I do think that we should have a balance between the new member states, the Visegrad 4, and the older states. I think the regional interests in our region are less taken into account on the level of the EU. What counts most is the interest of the old member states, and the decisions taken there are not always in line with our interests. And I do not always mean national interests alone. I also think sometimes decisions go against European interests, because a strong Europe can never be strong in some parts and weak in some parts. Look at the southern states of the EU. They also have their individual interests, and the same is true for Central European states or the Nordic countries. Here I think we need new decision-making mechanisms, not immediately making Hungary the leader of the European Union. We are just 10 million euros, so don't be 10 million people, so don't be afraid of the Hungarians. But I do think we need to change many things for the future, and I hope very much this will indeed happen after the next European elections. Timothy, I'd like to move over to Vladimir Putin, but you also wanted to say something.
It's very interesting. I mean, look, I teach the history of Eastern Europe. I think about Hungarian history, all year, every year. And when I think back to the 19th century, to figures like Stepan Széchenyi and so on, I see Hungary as a completely normal European country where during the period of revolution, romanticism, revolution, industrial revolution, state building and so on, Hungarian political thought is largely the same as European political thought. That is, there's always a vision of the future in it. And I think in this sense, I mean, the response is also very typical of European or Western political thought now. The question is, where is the future? And the answer is, we would like to criticize some institution that we're in now, right? And that's the answer that everybody has. It's just given in a particularly clear form by the Hungarian colleague. Trump's version of the future is that he would like to criticize Washington, D.C., right? The populist version of the future is that they would like to criticize the European Union. Mr. Putin's version of the future is that he would like to criticize the United States of America. But everyone being critical of something else, which they claim is hegemonic, is not the same thing as having a vision of the future. On the contrary, that's a completely cyclical way of seeing the world. Because what you're doing is you're saying, before this other thing became hegemonic, we were nice and innocent and good. So if only we could weaken Washington, D.C., or weaken the European Union, or weaken America around the world, then our nice, natural, normal, national self could return. That is not a vision of the future at all. That is a recycling of a mythological past. And this is, I'm not making a particular point about Hungary, because everyone does this, including the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans. Everyone does this now. And it's a serious point about what we mean by strong leadership. If our best definition of strength is, I'm going to say, somebody else is actually stronger than me, and here is my criticism of him. If that's my definition of strength, I'm not strong.
Genau da anknüpfen.
Exactly. Following on that, even if Vladimir Putin has no vision of the future, there will be a future anyway. What will the future look like? The future that Putin is leading Russia into?
It's a wonderful question, because in this, as in I think so many other domains, Russian politics is very helpful for us in seeing the way things might go. It's very tempting to look at Russia and say, well, it's mysterious, it's oriental, it's far away, or it's some kind of failed transition. No, Russia is a vision of where we can all go, and in some senses are going. Russia is a country where it is very difficult to talk about the future in a literal sense. I mean, I quite agree with what Sylvie Kauffmann says about Putin's personal centralization of power, but that is a way precisely of consuming the future. Right? The Politburo had a problem with the future because there was no succession principle in the Soviet Union, but at least you could have some notion that there would be a power struggle and somebody would win, right? But with Putin, really nobody has any idea. I mean, another way of saying what you said, I think, is to say that he's closed off all reasonable discussions of what the succession is going to be. And that is hideously dangerous, right? It means that the Russian state itself has been put in danger, and because the Russian state has been put in danger, you can't talk about the future, and that creates this sort of vicious cycle. So when you ask me where the Russian future is, I think you're getting to what the heart of the problem is for everybody. Do we ourselves follow Russia and cease to talk about the future? Or do we realize that a truly strong leader would be one who has a vision of how a European Union, for example, could make the future significantly different than the present already is? So I mean, to answer your literal question, I don't think the future of the Russian Federation looks very good. I think there's a kind of diabolical perfection in the way in which Mr. Putin has painted his country into a corner.
Could I come in here?
Actually,
I mean, Tim is speaking about Russia as if, we should be able to see the future in Russia. When President Obama was first elected, I mean, did people in America see Donald J. Trump coming? Was he on the horizon? There was somebody who would, defy all the conventions of the American Constitution and probably quite a few of the articles as well. 10 years ago, did we in Britain see Brexit coming and a place outside the European Union? I think the idea that we should be able to see the future of Russia is misguided, because we don't see the future of any country. My own view is that the next president of Russia will have views not unlike those of Putin, because Putin is a product of the Soviet period, and he missed perestroika because he was a KGB officer in East Germany at the time. And he's a product of what happened since the 1990s, the reaction against him, and NATO expansion, all the rest of it. I mean, after all, people like George Kennan predicted that Russia would again become an enemy, that this was a self-fulfilled prophecy, that NATO would be needed, and this is the way Putin sees it, the way many Russians see it. And on the checklist of strong leaders, I mean, put in the sense of dictatorial leaders, power maximizers, Putin's certainly up there, but he's nothing compared with el-Sisi in Egypt, and we make much less fuss about Sisi.
But the situation, how much is actually the current situation we see in Russia today a product of the personality of Putin? In 2000, if somebody else would have come up, if things would have gone a little differently, would Russia look completely different today? Is it really, is it the person? Is it because we're talking about leaders here? Is it Putin personally, or was it the system that created him? What is it?
I think to a large extent he's a creation of post-Soviet Russian development. I don't think there's anything so very special about Putin's
So it was
personality.
inevitable? Was it inevitable? Was the development actually?
I don't think it was inevitable. I think some of the decisions that Yeltsin took led to this. Yeltsin was not very interested, to put it mildly, in democratic institution building, not very respectful of rule of law. What mattered for Yeltsin was personal loyalty to him, and he was assured that Putin would be personally loyal and would look after him and his family thereafter. And so Yeltsin had a big say. I mean, he was the primary person responsible for appointing Putin. Who had heard of Putin? Not 1 in 100 Russians at the time when he first emerged. I mean, Gorbachev, I think, was a very distinctive and crucially important historical personality, to a lesser extent, but still significantly so was Yeltsin. Putin, I think, much less so.
Sylvie Kauffmann, gibt es eine Zukunft Russlands, die nicht so grimmig
Will there be a future of Russia that doesn't look that grim? Could there be a democratic development?
Interesting that you're asking, and I'm not a historian, but that you're asking a question about the future to historians, but I guess that's a part of reading the future. I mean, history helps, of course, but one thing which I would like to say, and this is where we haven't pronounced the word dictator yet, I think, but one distinctive characteristic of dictators is that they don't organize their succession because they want to be in power forever. Right. And we have a whole range at the moment. I was just drawing the list while you were talking.
Please go.
Look, Algeria, we have this big, for France it's very interesting. I know it's not so interesting for the rest of the world, but it should be. In Algeria, we have a very big crisis since February 22nd because the dictator Bouteflika, who was unable to exercise power but thought he would be there, was totally unable to organize his succession. We have a different kind of problem. It's the same problem in Venezuela. We have, of course, Putin, who is unable to organize his succession. We have Xi Jinping, who decided he could be there for life. We have Erdogan, who is also strengthening his power. So it's, I think when we talk about strong leaders in Europe, we are in a little bit of a different situation, I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should come to Europe, Western Europe, then.
Ich denke, das sind
Well, I think it's important what was just said. Inside, it all takes place, that discussion about Hungary, about France, Poland, Hungary, Germany, in a certain legal framework. We have created that legal framework, and Hungary has accepted this legal framework when we joined in 2004. And things are managed within that legal framework. So you cannot really compare such countries as Singapore and other countries of the world with the situation that we have within our European Union. We do have a framework. In 2004, I was actively involved in the accession process. 2011, we had the new Hungarian constitution. The older constitution was adopted in 1949. Well, you wouldn't know what that means, Hungary 1949. So we had a new constitution adopted with a 2/3 majority in 2011. We have adopted a media law, and we were criticized by the European Commission and also by part of the European public. And we said, all right, we accept legal proceedings where all these laws, all these acts will be analyzed, will be checked. And there were a number of criticisms where they said, well, this goes against European acquis communautaire. We changed that. We changed the constitution, we changed the media law, and we are always willing within that legal framework to discuss things. So concentration of power in one hand, that is something that does not take place. It's not reality. I mean, we are currently not just focusing on Viktor Orban and Hungary, but allow me one more sentence regarding the last statements. Don't you think it always goes two ways, but we do have a process of change as well. We are building up an enemy image, an enemy stereotype. The new populists will be Europe's enemies. But on the other hand, we could also look at things from a different angle. Because when we just talk about the enemy stereotypes, we are not ignoring the real problems that we have. You said we used to be normal Europeans in the 19th century. We no longer were normal in the 20th. No, I said you were normal now too. I think you're a bit more normal than you used to be. Isn't that the way that politics always work? You have your opponents, you have your supporters. Can I respond to that? Because that is a very important issue. When you say, it's always the same with politics, that you start with an enemy, an opponent. Okay, not an enemy maybe, but an opponent. If it's always like that, where you start everything by identifying an opponent, well, that's one way of making politics. But this whole discussion is about whether there is another way of doing politics, and I do think we also have other ways and means to conduct political endeavors. If you say there's always, the first thing is always to identify or build your enemy, your opponent, that means you politically go into one direction. But if you say, okay, let's start with a discussion about plural interests, plural perspectives, then we would have another way of doing politics. For me, it is important to say that both types of policy making exist. And if you say we should have a discussion about the ways politics should be made, but then we really have to see those two different preconditions. Where do I start? Identifying an enemy or identifying plural interests? I think the definition of strength in your case is different than it is in other regions. Let me follow on that. So for a moderator, for a facilitator, of course, it's not so easy when we have no unity about the definition of our original problem. Let me ask you the following question. When we look at different European countries, when we look at France, for instance, how about this model of policy making focusing on pluralism as it was just described by Tim? Would that exclude strong leaderships, or it depends, of course, maybe on the political traditions, because the French political system is different from the German one. Maybe you have a tradition where you have a solid pluralism that can live and thrive, although you have a strong leader. Is that the case in France, or is that maybe also a problem?
Well, this is a panel about history, so I'll go back to recent history of the 20th century in 1958, and that's when de Gaulle was called back by Parliament in the mid of the Algerian crisis. France was on the verge of civil war, and he was asked to form a government of national unity and supervise the writing of a new constitution. So there was a parliamentary regime, which was the Fourth Republic, but it was not working. Political parties were divided. It was totally, France had become ungovernable, and there was this Algerian issue, which was a very acute crisis. So de Gaulle had this constitution written, which is still the constitution which rules France today, and which instituted the Fifth Republic, and built a presidential system. That was what was, and this constitution was approved by referendum with an 80% majority. So there was what you would call a huge consensus. It was amended several times, and in 1962 there was another referendum to strengthen this presidential regime, because then the presidential would be elected through direct popular vote, which is still the case today. So we have a presidential regime with a strong president
Powers unthinkable
who has
in
strong
Germany.
powers, obviously totally different from the British system or the German system, just to name these ones. And I would say also pretty exceptional in Europe. But it works, and it's been adapted. For instance, the term of the president was 7 years. We realized after 2 terms of Mitterrand that 14 years was a bit of a long time, though in Germany you may differ. But so we shortened the term to 5 years, which brought another institutional problem, because now it's exactly the same as the term of the parliament, and we realize it is also a problem to have the 2 elections at the same time. So there is a cultural, if you want, a historical reason. It was built by de Gaulle for de Gaulle, but it still works.
Aber kommt es nicht heute?
But wouldn't you say you've reached the limits now?
To say also it works because we had checks and balances, because it's a presidential system, but it is a fundamentally democratic system. Right? We have a parliament which is obviously much weaker than, has weaker powers than yours here, but which is still a parliament. We have, separation of powers. We have a constitutional court which checks the laws and so on. Now, why does we could say that it's reached its limits, and Emmanuel Macron himself, though he rode to power with this system, and very much, tries to get inspiration from this towering figure of General de Gaulle. But the circumstances obviously are very different, and he himself is a very different person. De Gaulle had all this legitimacy from the war and from the resistance during World War II. Obviously, Macron doesn't have this kind of weight or legitimacy, so he had to build his persona around other, this is another phenomenon that we might talk about, which is the personalization of power in Western democracy, which is really a phenomenon which has been increasing. And Macron has pushed it to the extreme, with all this theater. He replaced this kind of, he compensated the lack of historical weight or legitimacy or even political experience that he didn't have with this dramatization of power.
Das würde ich gerade gerne auch Professor Brown fragen, weil hat ja auch.
I would like to ask Professor Brown. You know that's got a problem with the myth of, especially that democracy, that the myth of this strong leader. But would you not today wish for a stronger prime minister in the UK? Is that problem really the strength at the moment, or the weakness rather?
I said at the outset that I was not against strong government, provided that, in the sense of a government that could get things done, provided that government is fully accountable to the electorate, to a parliament, and the rule of law. I don't think this needs to be an overmighty individual leader. Indeed, Theresa May got herself into this problem because she wanted to become stronger. She wanted to achieve dominance over her government and party. She held an election she didn't need to hold, and on the slogan of strong and stable government. And she personalized this campaign in a way that went further than any previous British Prime Minister. I live in a marginal constituency, and I got a letter from Theresa May, as everyone there did, saying to vote for me. It wasn't the name of her candidate wasn't mentioned, the party wasn't mentioned. A vote for a local candidate was a vote for her. And she personalized it, and then she turned a small but workable majority into a minority government that spends more time negotiating with itself and with the small Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, even more doing that than with the EU. So it's a terrible mess of her own making. So the idea that, all would have been well, or would even have been better if she had had more personal power, no, I don't accept that at all. And Cameron had enough power to decide to hold a referendum in order to solve a problem within his own party, and he bequeathed an almighty problem to the country. The EU was about number 6 or number 7 in the issues that most concern the British electorate, but it was number 1 in the small and dwindling ranks of the Conservative Party.
Actually, surprisingly, and I think President Trump would be most surprised, we didn't talk about President Trump yet a lot. It was mentioned twice or so. That has to change now. We have to talk about him. And Professor Brown, I'd like to read a quote from you. You said, I think 2 years ago, it is exceedingly difficult for an American president to become overpowerful given the constitutional constraints, institutional obstacles, and powerful interests that confront him or her. Is that still true?
It's less true than it was, clearly, because if you get a president who doesn't respect the Constitution, doesn't respect the traditional values of the American system, then even the American system can be threatened. I mean, I give examples of the two 20th century leaders that one would regard as pretty strong leaders in the American presidency, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. And they pushed to the limits of the Constitution to get things through. But they had to work through the legislature. And Johnson, worked incredibly, worked telephones all the time, bringing congressmen over. He got legislation through that Kennedy could not get through his ability to persuade and cajole congressmen to pass it. So that was a legitimate use of the powers of the presidency. Now we've got a president employing illegitimate powers of the presidency. I mean, the powers that no president previously would aspire to. So that is a threat, and so this is a real test of the checks and balances of the American Constitution.
Wir werden noch ein paar Minuten hier reden.
So we're going to spend a few more minutes to chat here, and then we're going to go to the audience. So time's running out a little bit, but it's always the fault of the moderator, mind you. Professor Snyder, I'd like to ask you similarly, so if you look at the past 2 years, is the situation in the United States with regard to constitutional order, is it better, worse, or roughly as you would expect at the beginning of the presidency?
As I thought it would be, but I think it's much worse than most people thought it would be. The general response in the United States to the Trump election was to say, among his opponents was to say, well, we have the balance of powers and we have the rule of law and we have the Constitution and that will automatically protect us. But as Archie Brown has just reminded us, the institutions and the rule of law are not living creatures that move through the world. They are things which depend upon whether people respect them and speak out for them and are willing to take risks for them. So the United States is now in a constitutional crisis because the president and his agents are refusing to obey the law in some fairly clear cases. And it works in interestingly to the general theme of our discussions, because of course Mr. Trump is a politician who wants to be a strong leader in the sense of blaming everything on someone else, right? He wants to be strong in the sense of being against the system. He wants to blame things on the immigrants, the blacks, and so on. He wants to blame things on others. But if he succeeds by, God forbid, breaking the American Constitution, if he actually does all the things he said he would do, like, for example, not respecting democratic elections in 2020, if he succeeds in those things, will he be a strong leader in the sense of leading a stronger country? No. It will be a weaker country, right, than it was before. And that's the paradox I've been trying to push towards. You can become relatively stronger in a system by reducing the total amount of power to be wielded. And it seems to me that that's the danger we face.
Bevor wir ins Publikum gehen,
So before we go into the audience, Timothy Snyder, maybe just this question because you've got the historical context that you want to put it into. So in what historical tradition does President Trump actually stand in the United States and beyond the United States?
There's so many things that people think historians can do. and then there are some things that we can actually do. So people tend to think historians can only talk about tradition and what's the same. But actually being a historian is largely about noticing when things change. And when you're a historian living in the real world, you're often struck by how other people aren't noticing that things have changed. So of course one can say Mr. Trump refers back to certain traditions, because he does. He refers back to the tradition of America First, which was in the 1930s, as many of you will know, it was a tradition of isolationism. We shouldn't fight the Nazis because we're basically like them. That's what America First meant. We're all basically white people and we're against the black and brown people. That was America First. America First said, let's not allow any Jewish refugees to the United States, which we didn't, by the way, basically. And America First was also, incidentally, against the welfare state. So Mr. Trump does actively refer to that tradition. And you could also say indirectly he refers to, and sometimes directly, I'm sure Jason Stanley will have more to say about this, to American traditions of racism against African Americans. But nevertheless, things have changed in certain respects. I mean, there's a way, Mr. Trump also is a creature of a different moment, which we haven't talked about at all, which is the moment of digital politics. I mean, there's a very smart, I think he's here in Berlin, German cultural theorist called Martin Burkhardt, who wrote a book called Philosophie der Maschine. And one of his ideas is that you can have a Denker ohne Denken. You can have umgekehrt. Denken ohne Denker, there can be thinking without a thinker. You can also be led without a leader. I mean, a lot of what's happened to our politics is that we're being led around to various places by digital actors who are not necessarily under the direct control of anyone at all. If you look at the American elections in 2016, was Mr. Trump really in charge of his own campaign? He was looking on happily as Russia ran a big part of it. But was Russia actually in charge of the part that they ran? Not entirely, because their own digital creatures were not entirely under their control. Were Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin a bit surprised in November 2016 when he won? Yes, I believe they were. But even more interestingly, the oligarchs of Silicon Valley were also surprised, right? Which suggests that maybe things are a little bit out of control in a certain sense, that we can be led by things that aren't at all leaders, right? And Mr. Trump is, I think, a product of that era, just as in a certain sense the Russian leaders of today are a product of the end of the Soviet Union. His history is also about how things change, and this phenomenon of being led without there being leaders at all, I think, is our moment.
An diesem Punkt würde ich gerne ins Publikum gehen. Wir haben
So at this point I'd like to go to the audience. We've got 20 minutes left and I'd like to gather some questions. So please introduce yourself. And so we don't have a lot of time. Just keep your answers brief and tell me who you address the question to. So we'll just go through a couple of questions.
And Yash, I'm heading the House of the Wannsee conference here in Berlin. But I have a different question. I wonder sometimes if we don't give too much honor and too much credit to Trump, Putin, and also Viktor Orban, because we didn't speak about the monetary interests in the Orban family. The son-in-law of Orban is known to have profited enormously from Orban's rule. I just talked to the DA of Washington on Friday, who told me about a criminal investigation against Trump for using the White House for business purposes. And we know that Putin is shoveling billions to accounts in Switzerland. And maybe it's not so different from people like Mobutu or Mugabe. And maybe we are just attributing an ideological agenda to them, which goes far too long. It's just a provocative question.
Thank you. Clearly a question to Mr. Balog and to Mr. Snyder, but I'm going to collect a couple of more, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Sylvie Kauffmann. I'm a professor for conflict management at the University of Erfurt Willy Brandt School of Public Policy. My question deals actually not with the, let's say, terms and traits of leadership, but the linkage to democracy. And actually we haven't talked that much about the linkage of leadership to democracy, while one of the critical junctures I observe currently is that we are not talking anymore about the flip sides of leadership in authoritarian or dictatorship contexts, but in democratic contexts, right? So the problematic leaders, or not put it problematic leaders, but the leaders who are a threat to democracy are actually elected by or are results of democratic states. And this reflection was not part of the panel that much. It came a little bit up in the end with the problem of digitalization in elections and stuff like that, but I would like to just shortly bring that point in, the linkage between leadership and democracy.
Thank you very much. Please.
Mirko Krupa, EU Delegation Moscow. Maybe you could reflect a bit more on the notion of sovereignty, which is something that all the, let's say, leaders we are talking about talk a lot, that they say sovereignty is something of a high value. It comes a bit in connection with my country first. But I think it's an expression or a sign of actually a governance dispute that we are having here, like a rule of law system that is meant to limit power, that is meant to bring under institutional control somebody also with an electorate mandate, versus the concept of being above the law, which is common to many of leaders that we have in the non-European world. And maybe, I think it's a question to the whole audience to look a bit at these governance concepts. Thank you.
A last question, sorry, maybe there, lady.
Birte Förster, I'm a historian currently based at Humboldt University. I have two small remarks and a question addressed to Timothy Snyder. Thank you for pointing out the weaknesses of the strong, so-called strong leaders, and I'd like to add the closing down of the Central European University to that list of weaknesses. I also very much like the idea of taking people back in time, which I think is also happening in the United Kingdom by Brexit, with also a very open future, and the United Kingdom may not be so united anymore in the very near future. But my question is actually, you pointed out that these strong leaders didn't have a positive idea of the future, and I wanted to turn that question around and ask, do actually the others who have a pluralistic idea of the future have a positive narrative, and that relates to the overall topic of our conference, I guess, other than we want to be pluralistic, such as, for instance, Rainer Forst and his Rechtfertigungsgesellschaft. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So we have a question about financial interests, about leadership and democracy, sovereignty, and the idea of the future. Maybe, Mr. Balog, do you want to start with the financial interests of Prime Minister Orban?
Mine?
Yeah. Not your financial interests, but those of the Prime Minister.
Ich bin kostenlos hier insofern.
So I'm free here, that's why I'm not affected. So I'm happy that somebody from Wannsee is talking about, is so well informed about the financial situation of Orban and his son-in-law. I'm not so well informed about that. Two things I can say is, one thing is that there is a law and system in Hungary, and if somebody notices corruption, or be it authorities or citizens, then they should then file a report, and there will be an investigation. And there are some investigations, not just in Hungary, but in many other countries as well, even in the western part of Europe, where the use of EU funds, etc., is being investigated. So there's also interstate funds of the EU budget. So if they are not used properly, then that should be followed up on. And that's not any different in Hungary than in Germany or otherwise. So that I'm not just pretend that I wouldn't understand your question. So, of course, it is the case that so after 2010, we tried with legal means to, how shall I say it, to create a national or in a Hungarian financial a strong middle class. So this is the case. Hungary, after privatization of 1990, there was a very weak state back in the 90s, and we believe that there was too many foreign shares acquired by foreigners, and this was not so. German companies, French companies, American companies, and we said, so we want to try also with legal means. Then there was the tax war, which we waged against banks and utilities, admittedly, and then either to give it back to state ownership in Hungary or into the hands of the people who are not just want to have the income but also spend the money in Hungary. So the national enrichment there is something that is a fact. I can say that much, and maybe about this point with the Central European University. So it is not, has not been closed. It's a typical example for someone who, so I'm talking to you, yes. So the Central European University has not been closed. So because if you read that in the newspaper, then you read the wrong newspaper. Come to Hungary, have a look. It is open. It's an open society, open university, and people hold lectures there and also issue diplomas. However, that would not be possible in Germany and Bavaria or other federal states. Such a university that exists with us, with these conditions, this could not exist in Germany. So we cannot go in a detail there. I think it's got something to do with the EU Commission. So Timothy Snyder, there's several questions to you.
Which address the questions in a general way. The first has to do with the question about Hungary. I did try to, I used the word oligarchy, and I used it with an intention here. If it turns out that the purpose of running the government was to hide money yourself, or to help other people hide money, or if it turns out that your government is powerless to deal with the concentration of wealth in your country, you're probably not a strong leader, right? If the power is actually somewhere else, then in some sense it's all a magic trick. You know, so let's say, for example, that Amazon paid zero tax. I mean, imagine a crazy situation where Amazon paid no taxes. You might be tempted to think you should look, you know, somewhere else. So I think you have your finger on a very real issue, and it's different from the middle of the 20th century, as I was trying to say. Second thing, on democracy. I mean, the reason why we have democracy is because, I'm going to betray a big secret, it's because people are not very nice, right? It's not that democratic elections bring people to power who want to control the power. It's that people in general want to have all the power, and democratic elections are one means among many to keep us from being as bad as we might be under other situations. The democratic elections don't fulfill that function unless they're held up by other aspects of a pluralistic political system, like the rule of law and like checks and balances. But I would still maintain, if you have a democratic system with the rule of law and checks and balances, you are less likely to get undemocratic people realizing their potential to the fullest than otherwise. And I think the phenomenon which is actually worrying, which we see with Trump, is that people win with the part of the system which is least democratic, right? So in the US, as you might remember, Mr. Trump's opponent won 3 million more votes than he did. But thanks to the 3 million, that's a lot, right? Mm-hmm. That's how many flights were late to Tegel this morning. I mean, so if the system were fully democratic, then he would have lost. And now that he's in power, he naturally pushes the system to be less democratic than it already is. So I don't actually think that's the problem. I think democracy is part of the solution. On this question of governance, and going back to what Sylvie Kauffmann said about de Gaulle, I want to make a larger point, which is that there's no nation state. That's my larger point, okay? The nation state never happened. The nation state is a side effect of the European Union's myth of itself. The European Union's myth of itself is we were all nice nation states, but then we had a couple world wars, then we realized that was a mistake. Then coal and steel, Treaty of Rome, and so on. That's all total nonsense, right? That's complete and utter nonsense. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the Belgians, all of them except the Luxembourgeois, they were all empires. They were not nation states. They'd never been nation states. The transition that de Gaulle makes in 1962 is a transition that has nothing to do with the French nation state, which has never existed. It has to do with, and this is why he's a genius. It has to do with making the transition from empire to Europe. The French state shifts from being an imperial state to being a European state. There is never a moment when it's a nation state. Never happens, right? And so the problem with this whole, and it goes back to Brexit, the problem with this whole narrative that nation states made the European Union is then people can say, oh, why don't we go back to the nation state? With the little problem that the nation state never existed, or in the case of Eastern Europe, where it did exist, it was always destroyed or dominated or something very bad happened to it, which in 1989 people still remembered. So I would phrase the question in a different way, right? Going back to the nation state is not just going back to weakness, it's going back to something which never actually happened, so you don't even know how weak you're going to be, but my guess is going to be pretty weak. And then on this question of the future, I think that we have, the liberals, whatever, the pluralists, what the liberals, the pluralists did after 1989 was that they inherited historical determinism from the communists, right? They said, your story about how capitalism is going to bring socialism is wrong, but our story about how capitalism is going to bring democracy is right? And that is, of course, completely pacifying. It means that you don't feel, you don't have to take care of the future because some other thing is going to take care of the future for you. And so my answer is that democratic politics basically has to come down to ethics. You have to say, I see a vision of the future which is good, and I'm going to fight for it, right?
Thank you very much, Sylvie Kauffmann. Choose your questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to address this issue of linkage with democracy, which is obviously very important because we have come to realize that democracy is, of course, much more than elections. And you were asking me earlier about the French presidential system, whether it had reached its limits. And of course, it's not only the presidential system which has reached its limits in France with this very deep social crisis that we have been witnessing for the past 6 months, and the Gilets jaunes, it's a crisis of our of democratic representativity, and we have coming up a whole range of a category of people who thinks they are not represented in our system. It doesn't have to do only with the presidential system or parliamentary system. We have now societies and digital actors, and I know there is a panel on this later on, so I will not dwell into this, and I think it's great that there is a whole panel on this, but this has changed fundamentally the political landscape in our countries. In France it is, of course in America, in the United States it's obvious, but in France it's becoming also obvious. We have, dueling facts, dueling tracks of reality which don't join, never join. And so it is very difficult to have a political representativity and cohesion when people don't get their facts from the same sources or don't see the facts on, it's the basis of information which is there. So yes, the linkage with democracy is extremely important, I agree, but what is democracy? This is the whole question.
Thank you. Archie Brown.
Yeah, I'd also like to say a few words about leadership and democracy. Though I argue very much against overmighty leaders, I fully accept we need leadership in a democracy. The very phrase, the will of the people, is a myth. The people don't have a will. They've got a multitude of interests and a multitude of values, and we need representatives to take decisions and pay some account to what are temporary majorities and sometimes argue against them. But we've been speaking about political leaders as power holders, the office holders, the heads of government. And actually leadership in a democracy in its purest form is when people don't have any patronage to bestow, don't have any sanctions that they can apply to members of the government who might disagree with them. Leaders in a democracy who are the purest leaders are those who attract a following and persuade people without having any of those powers. And two of the most remarkable examples in recent years are very young women. Malala Yousafzai, who as a 15-year-old in the Swat Valley of Pakistan campaigned for girls' education, was shot in the head, almost killed, had numerous operations, is now a student at the University of Oxford. Later she went to Nigeria to campaign for the release of girls who had been imprisoned from a predominantly Christian school, imprisoned, kidnapped by Boko Haram, an extreme Islamist group. Then she campaigned against female genital mutilation practiced by some of her fellow Muslims. And at the age of 17, she became the youngest ever winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. And more recently, we've got Greta Thunberg, who spent the Easter week speaking to the Pope, speaking to 25,000 people in Rome, speaking to European Parliament, speaking in London in Trafalgar Square, speaking to politicians, and now the First Secretary of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, a number of other leaders have agreed to meet with green activists and make sure that their policies are in line with the Paris Agreement. Well, that was tremendous influence, and this is another young potential candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. So leadership can mean many different things. Finally, somebody mentioned the possible breakup of the United Kingdom. Well, I'm a Scot who has lived most of his 81 years in England, but I grew up in Scotland, so still feel very much a Scot. And it's perfectly true. Scotland voted 62% Remain and is being taken out of the European Union against its will. Northern Ireland voted to remain and is being taken out. So there is a very serious danger of the breakup of the United Kingdom. And the people who campaigned for leave, they didn't give a thought to this. So it was an incredible act of national self-imposed humiliation and quite conceivably could lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir kommen zum Ende unserer Zeit und ich will gar nicht...
Thank you very much. We have used up our time and I'm not even going to try to summarize. I wouldn't succeed in doing that. But I request all our panelists. Timothy Snyder has listed 20 items that we should all have in mind in order to avoid tyranny. My request was in contrast to Timothy Snyder, probably he will mention 20 or 21 items. Can you mention one item that is the most important item for us to avoid tyranny? Silly, you first.
I guess pluralism, to make sure that in any field of the society and in political life, you respect pluralism and you guarantee that there is pluralism. And just one thing I wanted to add to what Professor Brown said, it's just one thing. We've talked about strong men, and there were no strong women around, among those men. Just a food for thought.
Important point, thank you for that. Professor Brown.
Well, I think a skepticism...
More women, that was your more women. That was. I take this as part of the answer.
I agree that, accepting the value of pluralism, accepting that there is a variety of interests and values in any society and being respectful of these, that's very important. And along with a skepticism about leaders, and never be obsequious to a leader.
Thank you. Professor Balog.
Ich wünsche für Europa.
For Europe and for us, I wish to have a policy that is closer to the real interests of the people. And I see the biggest danger in this politics just conducted in the interest of elites, less and less linked to reality. Professor Snyder, what we describe as return to a nation state, that is not a return, although we still see the image of history. But I think returning to the national state would be a new way of existing as a nation.
It might be new, but it's been tried before in Hungarian history, and you know very well where it led. So I'd like to end by agreeing with the very important point that for democracy and for a leader who's strong in the sense of good, the interests and the concerns and the thoughts of the individual constituents, citizens, voters are what matter. How do we know what those are? How do we know what those are? It's not good enough to be a populist and say, well, whatever the elite says is wrong, because then you're just transforming yourself into the new elite who says, well, I know what the will of the people is. And there's no will of the people. So how do we actually know? My most important point would be states who want to protect democracies have to actively protect in the sense of produce factuality. We cannot know what is good for people and what people want unless people really know what's going on in the world around themselves. One of the ways that digitalization hurts democracy is that it takes ever fewer facts and it spins them ever thinner, right, over an ever larger population. We not only know less than we did 10 years ago, we're actually stupider than we were 10 years ago. Yes, we are. And if you don't know it, that's a bad sign. right off the bat, right? If you were surprised when I said that, think for a minute about what that means. But so in all seriousness, for me, the most serious point would be, and this, if you care about what the people really want, you have to make sure that people know as much as possible about their circumstances, which means positively supporting, incentivizing, subsidizing, taxing Google and Facebook to support local journalism and independent journalism and investigative journalism.
Which I can only support. So we have, pluralism. We have the will of the people. We have facts. If I may just say a last word, that's of course what we need is open and frank debate, discussion, which we here tried to have. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.